welcome back here in the Keynote area. If you are ready, Juuso is, so we can start. Oh, I see some people coming, but we are really happy that you want to be here. In the corona pandemic, you did a webinar for us, and so everybody, you can see he's real.
I'm a human being, a real person, yes.
So very nice that you came all over from Hong Kong or Finland or whatever to here and to be here and talk to us about assessment and how assessment shapes student identities. We're really looking forward for your talk. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Martin, for a lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say that it's 1 point for me and 0 points for the sunshine, because you're all here, even when you have wonderful options very close by. It is such an honor and such a pleasure to be here today in this wonderful, wonderful festival to talk to you a bit about assessment and student identities. First of all, before I even kick off, my contact details are there, so after my presentation we will have plenty of time for chats, conversations, questions, but if you have any further thoughts, do not hesitate to reach me out. So, what I would like to share during the next 45-ish minutes before a Q&A is a couple of thoughts from my research concerning how assessment shapes students in higher education. And I'll be talking quite a bit about assessment, but as you will come to notice, this is very much a matter of feedback as well. Hello, there's still plenty of space. Welcome. So, today I would like to talk to you about assessment and student identities. And to me, when I first started working on these topics, the very first idea that I had in mind was, what do these two ideas have to do with each other? Can we even talk about assessment and personalities, identities in the same sentence? So I'm going to give you a bit of background information about what we are talking about here. And I've also prepared a few very practical strategies for better considering this idea in assessment and feedback design. Let me just introduce my key argument right away. So my talk today will not be a kind of a murder mystery that you will need to follow up to the end to find out what my argument is. My key argument today is that as we have, hello, welcome, there's plenty of space still. My key argument is that as we have focused on assessment and feedback innovations in many wonderful and exciting ways, the very profound idea of how assessment shapes students on a longer term is perhaps something that we have not paid attention enough so far, which is exactly what I would like to do today. So we're going to talk about how assessment does not only shape student learning, which is what we often focus on when we talk about assessment, but students themselves as well. The slides are available. You can follow the QR code or the link to get an access to them if you want to have a look at them later on. All right. I would like to start this session by sharing you two different stories about the power of assessment and feedback in shaping students. Again, not just student learning, but the students themselves. As I started to think about what kinds of stories I could tell about this topic, it wasn't actually very hard to come up with some thoughts. And I reckon it might be quite easy for you too to come up with some stories about how assessment and feedback have shaped you. So I have two stories. The first of them comes from myself. It comes from the times when I was still a student. So I was a teacher student myself. I'm a math teacher, and for some weird reason I always wanted to become a mathematics teacher since I was a child. And I ended up doing that. I was finishing up my studies, and on my very final year at uni, I was working on my master's thesis. I was very eager to get out of university at that point. And one of my last courses that I had to do was a course about educational research, which couldn't interest me at all. I thought, I don't know anything about research. I just want to graduate and get into the classroom. And one day I was working on my master's thesis on a hallway of a university, on a table, just by myself, doing some writing and reading. And the teacher of that educational research course happens to walk past. And she notices me and says hi. And I'm like, oh, hello. And we have a little chat. And she asks me, oh, what are you working with? And I show her, oh, my master's thesis. Look, I'm almost done. I'm almost out of the university. And she has a look at my computer. We have a brief conversation about my topic of my thesis. And she tells me, whoa, this could actually be real research. The research questions they're excellent, and you're doing a good job. And then she walked away. And this particular moment, I remember I just sat there and I thought, whoa, that felt so special to me. I didn't really know what it actually means to be a researcher. I always wanted to become a teacher. And I still refer to this moment when I think about a spark that really somehow led me into the world of educational research. And her words are really something that I still carry with me today. And what I think is remarkable about this story is that later on I have talked to this teacher, and she can't even remember this little interaction. She was just walking on a university hallway. We had a little chat. But it really impacted me. It really made me think, whoa, I could do something like this. I'm actually interested in research. A very profound change for an interaction that lasted maybe 4 minutes. I have another story. And this one is unfortunately a bit of a sadder story. It's a story not about university assessment, but a story about assessment in school. So this story concerns a close family member of mine, a boy who a couple of years ago was 7 years old and was doing his first year in school. I was visiting my family for Christmas, and I had a chat with this family member, this 7-year-old, who was very eager to tell me about his first months in school. And of course, I was very excited to hear about it. And he told me, ugh, I hate mathematics. And I thought, wait, you can't hate mathematics. I hate mathematics and I'm so bad at it. I always get bad grades, and the teacher tells me that I'm very bad at it. And we had a further conversation about this. And he had indeed received very low grades since the very first days he ever had in the school. And he had developed this idea during the first 4 months of his schooling that he's very bad at mathematics. And it was proven by the grades he had received. And I felt devastated. I thought, whoa, what a powerful story of how assessment can actually shape little human beings. His interest in mathematics was already destroyed in the very first year of school. And interestingly, during the same Christmas holiday, we were building Lego sets, like building blocks with him. And he was doing these Lego sets for 18 plus, like adults. And it was very easy for him. And his 3D thinking was just phenomenal. And I thought, and this kid thinks that he's bad at mathematics. He has such a wonderful, wonderful set of skills. I wanted to start with these two stories because they really emphasize the power of assessment and feedback in shaping us. But they're quite different stories. The first story was a story of quite informal feedback, something very fleeting, nothing designed. A teacher happens to walk in a hallway, stops to have a conversation with a student, and that's it. And I think this very, very nicely relates to Karen's talk just a while ago. This is really relational pedagogies in action. The other story is about the formal structures of assessment, grades, the formal structure that students have to go through as they enter school already when they're very young. And these kinds of experiences might have very long-lasting effects. So, you might think whether you can come up with a similar story yourself, whether it is easy to think about a moment of assessment or feedback that somehow changed your own understanding of yourself. So much for stories. My scholarly argument that I would like to start from is that based on research, we do not know too much about how assessment shapes students' identities, their very understanding of themselves. But we do know these stories. We all carry these stories as earlier students, as parents, as guardians, as teachers, we have heard these stories over and over again. So my question for this presentation is, how could we unpack these stories? How could we make sense of them? How could we use these stories that already exist in the social world and use them to come up with more sustainable assessment design? So that's my pretty tricky task that I have set for myself for the next 45-ish minutes. So, a few words about how are assessment and student identities connected to each other. There's a lot going on this slide. You can have a look at this very scholarly definition of professional identities. So today, as we talk about higher education, when we talk about student identities, we can mostly focus on those identities that we've developed for these professional contexts. Who am I as a future teacher? Who am I as a future lawyer or future engineer? It is quite often stated that it is the very goal of higher education and university education to develop these identities for our students. Higher education is not a vocational institution in a way that we should only focus on skills, competencies. We do not want every single graduate to be a clone of each other. We want our graduates to be diverse and unique. Of course, have certain skills at the same time. This is really the starting point that I have for my talk. And then the question is, okay, if we take this goal that is often stated in higher education policies, if we take this goal as our backbone for higher education, what about assessment? How could assessment meet this rather noble goal of developing students' professional identities? Typically, these ideas clash a bit because we have a very profound way of understanding assessment as a kind of a measurement practice. We want assessment to be ideally objective, valid and reliable. That's really what makes assessment assessment. And this is the most typical way of thinking about assessment, even when we want assessment to be more student-centered or demonstrate the student's active role. We carry this idea of assessment that all students should be assessed in the same way, based on the same criteria, or same standards. Oh, the floor is really creaking. And then the question is, how does this idea play along with the goal of developing students' unique professional identities, when assessment should be the same for everyone? This is really the profound dilemma that I will focus on today. This idea of assessment as measurement is not only a matter of summative assessment or testing, but a matter of all sorts of assessment, very much formative assessment or assessment for learning as well. Here's a quote from a study that I really, really like. It's about online formative assessment in the context of mathematics education, in which the scholars are trying to come up with a good way of determining students' mathematical abilities and providing them feedback as they proceed in their mathematical learning. And what they claim is that teachers should be able to make valid and reliable data of their students' skills, and in doing so provide them with high-quality feedback. Now this is all wonderful and exciting, and this is exactly what we need to do as teachers, who could make use of data that is invalid or not reliable at all. But at the same time, this really clashes with the idea of assessment as something social, as something that takes place in a social world. My work tries to challenge this idea of assessment as something seemingly objective. Instead, I take the viewpoint of, as very nicely formulated by Bert and colleagues, that assessment in educational settings always changes its target. If you want to measure my height or my weight, that measurement does not actually change these attributes. It remains the same. But when we assess students who are not objects, something changes. And we know this because we often want assessment to promote learning or promote motivation or self-efficacy and so forth and so forth. So this is the profound starting point for me today. Assessment always changes the object of being assessed. In this way, I see students as moving targets. Every time we try to assess students, they change. And then we need to measure them again, and they change again. This is what I mean with the metaphor of a moving target. This makes assessment pretty tricky, but also exciting. This idea, what follows from this idea is that assessment really doesn't only influence student learning, which it of course does, but the students themselves. Students might carry something from assessment in a longer term. And in this way, when I think about assessment, I think about these moments in higher education of which each one of them carries the potential of really changing students in one way or another. And I think my two stories that I started with were really examples of how this might happen in the social world. Importantly, these are often unintended ways of shaping students. When we design assessment, we have certain goals in mind, and we quite rarely design assessment from the viewpoint of student identity formation. We might want assessment to promote student learning, to increase their test scores, and at the same time, it might shape students in many unintended ways. And I have a few words about that in a moment. What I would like to see in assessment practice and research is a shift from these relatively short-term effects of assessment to the more longer-term effects that assessment has on our students. Often when we assess student work, student learning, we do that during a learning unit or course or after the course, and that's it. We focus on those very immediate effects of assessment. But if we want to understand how assessment shapes students, we must understand the longer-term effects that assessment has. For example, that story that I shared about my teacher, who I had a conversation with, it's something that I can still remember, that might still somehow spark something inside of me years and years and years later. In a way, we do know this already, because many universities have measures for making sure that assessment has desirable longer-term effects. We want to make sure that assessment doesn't, for example, cause too much stress for students. That's why we have services for conditions such as exam stress. I really like this learning resource of the University of Lincoln for students about how to deal with a bad grade, how to make sure that if you get a bad grade, you can still benefit from that learning experience. There's also been a recent strong emphasis on more inclusive assessments for more and more diverse students in higher education. So we do have an impetus of trying to do this, at least when it comes to ideas such as inclusion, well-being, student diversity. So my starting point for thinking about assessment in a social world is that assessment is, in fact, a part of the social world of higher education. It's a part of the fabric of life in higher education. It's not something separate. It's something that really is a part of everything that we do in higher education. And this would, of course, be also true for feedback. In many ways, assessment organizes life in higher education. From the teacher point of view, my year is very profoundly organized with the structures of assessment. It's not something separate that I do. In fact, my life is organized with assessment deadlines, with marking deadlines, and so forth. And it is the same for students. So I do think that we need to think about assessment and feedback not as some separate silos that we can design, but as something that is very much a part of life in higher education. So my approach to assessment, I really can't move on this slow, takes a life course approach. What I mean by this is that I see assessment as a part of our lives. It sounds relatively obvious, but I would actually argue that we rarely take this kind of an approach. Let me show you what I mean, and this is just a little bit of a silly example, but I'm just trying to make my point here. When we think about this lifelong project that we have of shaping our own selves or identities, how it often looks like is something like this. The way we develop as human beings is messy, complex. It's very hard to pinpoint how that happens. Assessment is only one part of what happens to our professional identities as we continue studying and working in this social world. And of course, we carry multiple different identities today, as we focus on higher education, we can mostly talk about professional identities. But of course, we must also understand that we have many identities that are quite inseparable from each other's. Where does your personal identity and professional identity end and begin? What are the boundaries? Of course, it's never very easy to say, and it might not even be necessary to think about this, but just for the sake of clarity, we can focus on professional identities today. So it's a messy process, and many different things, of course, during our life influence the way that we are shaped as human beings. If I would ask you, what are the most influential single points of time that have shaped you or your understanding of yourselves? It might not be, feedback in higher education, but many other things. Some messy things that happen to us in life. Some of them are more important, some of them might seem less important for the eyes of another. But all these different things shape us as we proceed in social life. Assessment is only one part of this. And I guess as an assessment researcher, it's sometimes quite tempting to say things like assessment drives learning as if it would be the most important factor. But in fact, it's only one part of this fabric of life that we are part of. One substantial idea that is in the background of my thinking is this idea of societies in which our children, students, our youth is increasingly measured from the day they are born, or in fact, quite a bit before that in many cases. So in my work, I draw on texts about metric societies, societies in which numbers, metrics, rankings, competition play a very massive role in education and beyond. And in many ways, the factors that influence our identity formation are often numerical in one way or another. And I think this is something very important to keep in mind. All right, so as our complex, messy identities develop, of course, as an educational researcher, I focus on these formal structures of education and the influence that they have on our identities. So today we can focus on formal education and, in our case, higher education, which is often a kind of a box that we enter and then we leave it. It's not always this simple. I know, of course, we might return back to higher education and so forth. For the sake of clarity, we can consider a student who enters higher education and then one day is out of the system and never returns. And what I'm interested in is, within this box of higher education, what is the role of assessment in shaping students? Higher education, of course, shapes students in many, many different ways. Students might be part of a student union. They might go to parties. They might meet friends. Then they go to lectures. Assessment is only one part of this fabric of life in higher education. As an analyst, as an educational researcher, the question for me is, what is the special role of assessment and feedback in all of this? And here I rely on the idea of an assessment encounter. These assessment situations that students encounter as they study in higher education. One day, they will have their first assessment encounter. Perhaps the first essay that is returned back to students, or their first exam situation, which is followed by many, many others, which here I represent with this are almost like hoops that you jump through throughout your studies. And then finally, as put by one of my students very nicely, then you're free from assessment. Finally, yes, our performance is assessed in workplace situations as well. But as one of my students told me, it's still freedom from assessment because you don't need to exams ever again in your life. Okay, and then the question is, how do these assessment encounters, how do they shape students? And how could we have more control of these situations? Again, to answer this question, I'm taking a life course approach, seeing assessment as a part of the fabric of life in students' lives and in higher education. This view, very importantly, takes a viewpoint of temporality. If we want to understand how an individual assessment task, for example, affects our students, we do need to consider the students' histories with assessment, and also the idea of how that assessment influences the futures of our students. So this idea of temporality is something that always has to be that we always have to take when we think about assessment as a part of our students' life course. So, how does assessment shape students? In the following slides, I will provide some thoughts based on my work, based on scholarly work. And as an educational researcher, I do think that it's important to study these topics, to publish journal articles and books out of this topic. But at the same time, I do want to remain humble to those stories that already exist in this world. We already know an answer to this question as former students, or perhaps as current students, parents, as guardians, as teachers. So we already have this cultural knowledge. And what I've been trying to do in my research is to make sense of it and try to understand a bit better in more scholarly terms. So if we take one assessment encounter, almost like one slice of this equation, how could we theorize and understand how it shapes students? I have a couple of thoughts. If you want to read a full story, I've published 2 open access articles on these issues, and they are quite long and detailed, so please have a look at the whole story. I do want to note that many of my thoughts are inspired by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Lily Young, who is a philosopher of higher education, and I have really benefited to collaborate with philosophers in the matters of assessment, and you can perhaps see that in the following slides. So, some thoughts. First of all, what is remarkable about assessment, as compared to many other factors that influence student identities, is that assessment is rarely something that students can design or have an influence on. More commonly, assessment shapes students from afar. Assessment is designed by educators for purposes defined by educators and higher education systems, policies, regulations, not students themselves. Often when we want assessment to better support student learning, to better support student motivation, student engagement, student self-efficacy, we still base these ideas on this assumption that students should relatively passively respond to our goals and aspirations as educators. And this is a very profound assumption in assessment. It builds on an idea that it is possible and desirable to shape someone from afar. Many other things students can influence in their own lives, but assessment less so. And I think this is a very much of an ethical issue. Another important thing about assessment that separates it from many other factors in your life that might influence your identity development is that the knowledge that assessment produces is powerful. It has a lot of social legitimacy in how it defines us. What I mean by this is that often assessment is seen as an expert practice. I got a grade B+, or 4 out of 5, or 98 points out of 100. This is seen as expert knowledge, even though it might not always be the case when it comes to assessment. And here I want to emphasize that I do not want to be deterministic. I do not want to say that assessment directly influences student identities. Instead, I see assessment as providing almost like building blocks for students that they can use in ways that they want to. And these building blocks are often quite powerful. I often compare assessment information to information provided by a medical doctor. You take part in some kind of operation and you get a result, 13.8. And that's considered to be objective and quite influential for how you understand yourself. Assessment often builds on a similar idea. Students take it for granted because they live in a world full of metrics in which objective data is considered to be quite influential for yourself. I do think that there's a lot of power when it comes to numbers in shaping ourselves in this world. This is one of my favorite papers about feedback, with one of the best titles, I would say, that academic research has had in a while. It's a paper by a wonderful list of colleagues who were studying students' feedback behavior. And as the name of the paper says, the students often just checked the grade and looked out. And now this study unpacks this situation for in a very lengthy way, why do students disengage with feedback? But I would argue here that one aspect here is that students are quite used to using numerical knowledge as they shape themselves and as they shape their learning behaviors. Numbers do carry a special meaning in contemporary higher education, which might mean that numbers are taken as more powerful than, say, verbal feedback. One of the very profound functions of assessment is that it ranks and selects. This might sound almost obvious, but I think particularly when we design sustainable feedback practices in higher education, we do need to remember that assessment in fact builds on a goal that is not always aligned with the goal of learning. Assessment necessarily needs to rank and select students for societal purposes, and this is also true in higher education. This is the reason why we grade our students, often by using, for example, the bell curve, explicitly or implicitly. This idea of GPA, grade point average, or the grades the student receives, they could be almost seen as the currency of higher education. If higher education is a social ecosystem, then these numbers are the currency that students can use to access certain places. And I think this idea, as obvious as it may seem, is something that we need to remember every time we want to design more sustainable and student-centered assessment and feedback practices. It's hard to escape this profound function of assessment. And this, of course, has a very direct influence on students' professional identities, because assessment can very profoundly open doors and close doors for our students. Assessment also holds the function of socialization. Assessment instills many social norms and cultural values to our students' thinking. This is both a hopeful and a bit of a dangerous message. To study in higher education means that you are becoming a practitioner in your field. This means that you do need to have certain professional values and norms that you take part in, often quite explicitly, such as in the context of, say, medical education or teacher education. So this is, of course, a wonderful idea. We do need to socialize our students with certain kinds of norms and values. At the same time, assessment often does this in unintended ways. You can think about a very universal ritual that we have in higher education. Students in rows writing exams silently in an exam hall. This is an image that you can find from almost any higher education institute from planet Earth. You can think about the different social norms that this situation represents. When I think about this situation, these are the first things that came to my mind. Diligence, grit, accuracy, a very important part of exams. Silence, there's an academic value that these assessment situations should be done in silence. I think that's something very interesting. Resilience, speed, we have time limits. Demonstrating your academic abilities needs to be speedy and fast. Authority, and there might be many others. And you may think of another assessment practice and think about what kinds of social norms and cultural values it demonstrates for students. As mentioned briefly before, assessment is always built on an idea of standardization. Now, this is not always the case for feedback, as you could see from my story that I started from, but assessment has to be built on at least some level of standardization. This is the current understanding that we have of assessment in higher education. In higher education, we rarely use completely standardized, statistically standardized tests as in school sector. But at the same time, we do aim to standardize our practices as much as possible. We want our students to demonstrate same learning objectives, the same standards and criteria, by using the same practices. This is seen as fair and objective, valid and reliable. And even when we ask our students to take part in more complex tasks, this idea of standardization is often in the background. Well, this is, of course, many times a very much needed way of thinking about assessment. At the same time, particularly when we think about our diverse students, which might mean many, many different things, of course, in the contemporary world. Not all students can very easily fit these standards that we set for our students. This might seem like a fairly abstract issue, and I think this one quote from a student who took part in our research project with my wonderful colleagues Molly Dollinger and Rachel Finneran, I think this quote really sums up what I'm trying to say here. So in this research project, we were studying the assessment experiences of students with disabilities in placements. And this student has taken part in a placement, and during and after the placement, the student also had to do some assessment tasks. And the student was quite frustrated. The student told us that I was forced to conform to this box. It doesn't depend on your abilities or disabilities, anything. It just do this. Every other student has to do this. I feel like there was very little wiggle or room. There was very little room for me to be me. And I think this is something very substantial about assessment. Many times in assessment, we need to almost like leave our identities out of it because we need to fit the box in order to get a good result. This is not necessarily something bad, but it's something that we must acknowledge, particularly if we want our students to demonstrate their skills in more complex ways. So, these are some of the ways that are quite intrinsic to assessment and feedback in how they shape students in higher education. I would argue that when we talk about higher education, we do have an ethical imperative to make sure that we do not only shape students from afar, but we also provide students with tools to take control of their own identities, to take control of their own growth in higher education. But it's a very tricky question of how to do this with assessment, because often assessment aims to do something a bit different. Assessment is predominantly designed by others, for the purposes of others. So how could it relinquish some of the control for students? It's a very tricky question, and I'm very eager to hear about what you think of this. I will first introduce a couple of assessment strategies that we might think about when we aspire to do something like this. And I've come up with 6 different ideas. First of all, my overall message here is that as we think about assessment, we do need to shift from thinking about the immediate learning outcomes that we want our students to demonstrate right away to looking at those much longer-term processes that students develop in higher education. So we need to shift from what did I learn just immediately to how did I develop myself as a future practitioner, as a future professional, as I took part in this assessment practice. And I do have to note that in higher education settings, the ideas of student learning and student identity development are not very separate in the first place. We are really talking about the same idea here. Every professional needs a certain set of skills and abilities. So every time students learn something, they also develop their own sense of their self as a professional. So when I think about assessment, I think about the questions of who are our students becoming? How does assessment support students in becoming the professional that they aspire to be? What kinds of professionals are they becoming? And how assessment could support students in this journey? All right, so I have 6 different ideas that I'm going to present, and after that, I would like to hear from you. First of all, taking a life course approach to the matters of assessment. I do see a lot of hope in making use of higher education as an academic space in which we could quite profoundly shape the norms and cultures around assessment that we currently have. If and when assessment shapes the stories that we tell about ourselves, it is higher education, I argue, where we can shape these stories. And we can do this quite quickly, I would say. We can do this quite rapidly. And I actually think that there's a lot of power in shaping or changing the assessment cultures we have as students enter higher education to demonstrate that now you are supposed to take more control of your own identity development processes. So what I often talk about in this context is this kind of a positive assessment shock. Students often have an assessment shock when they enter higher education. Assessment might be quite different from earlier stages of education. You need more control of your own learning. You need to be more involved in your own learning processes. This is already happening. But at the same time, assessment could start developing students' sense of their professional selves from the very first day. The second strategy that I thought about was programmatic assessment, and I think many of us in this room are already quite familiar with this idea, so I'm not going to very deeply talk about the idea in itself. I'm going to focus on how the idea of programmatic assessment could perhaps ideally develop students' professional identities. The idea of programmatic assessment builds on the idea that we have certain micro-level learning outcomes, or if still talking about module-level programmatic assessment, course learning outcomes that are somehow aligned with program learning outcomes. This is a model that my current university is using, that we have modules or courses whose learning objectives need to be aligned with wider program-level outcomes. And the idea of programmatic assessment would challenge us to think about how to assess the program learning outcomes as well. How to make students aware that this assessment practice is not only targeting your immediate skills, but these wider, longer-term skills that you are supposed to develop during a program. And I think programmatic assessment provides very exciting new avenues for the idea of professional identity development, because we might be able to shift students' thinking about assessment as an opportunity to gather knowledge and information about your developing identity in the longer term, and make students aware of how each of these individual assessment encounters could be used to develop your identity. I wanted to introduce you with one absolutely magnificent study about exactly this topic by colleagues Greenfield and colleagues, who were studying programmatic assessment in the context of medical education, where most of this research is originating from. This is a quote by one of the students who took part in programmatic assessment, and the researchers had a look at how programmatic assessment had developed the students' sense of their professional self. And one of the students reported that, I think that this is a very personalized system, which involves a lot of work, both on our part and on the person who has read our portfolio. It makes you feel a lot more like they see you as a whole person rather than as a, number. And I think this kind of a comment really makes me feel humble and almost silent, because I think about the shift that the student must have gone through about what the very purpose of assessment is and what you can do with the information that you get from an assessment encounter. So a very exciting idea, and I would be glad to see more work in this space. Some of you might already been doing that, and I would be glad to hear about it. Strategy number 3. When we think about individual assessment practices, something that I think we could pay more attention to is almost like the narrative potential that assessment has. What kinds of tools does one individual assessment practice provide for student identity development? I used a metaphor of a building block before, and I think it really works here. If each assessment practice provides some sorts of building blocks for students that they can then use in ways that they wish, how could we redesign these individual blocks to be perhaps a bit more diverse, a bit more complex? And this idea challenges us to think about more simplistic forms of assessment, such as multiple choice questions or very simple feedback messages, or numbers, grades, numerical data, from the viewpoint of what kinds of building blocks they provide for our students. What can students do with this information as they shape themselves? These are some of the very critical, profound answers that I started to think about when I thought, how could we design assessment to provide better tools or more complex tools for students to shape their identities? assessment tasks could be more divergent. And of course, there's already so much work on this area, but what I'm trying to do here is to shift this type of work to the world of identity development. What is the difference of numbers and words on how students build themselves? I think these are very intriguing questions for future research and practice. Seen from this viewpoint, I want to introduce two studies that have tried to use assessment as a way of restoring students' identities. One of them comes from Pranit Anand, who has been studying digital storytelling as a way of enabling students with more agency to take control of their own identities. In one of these studies, as cited here, the students were asked to write a digital story for a real audience about their development in higher education, about the abilities they had learned and how those abilities tap into their developing professional identities. If you're interested in reading more, definitely have a look at Pranit's work. Another very inspiring example comes from Monday and colleagues, who were studying blogging as a way of enabling students with complex forms of developing their identities and their abilities at the same time. They write about these art-based assessment practices as a way of developing students' authentic selves, because they provide students with ways of demonstrating their identities in complex ways. One of the students told in an interview that the process of this art-based blogging was very cathartic, and it helped me understand myself, and most importantly, my teaching philosophy. If we suppress the voice inside of us, it stifles us from, but if we set ourselves free through art, then we can understand other people better and perhaps become better professionals. I'm a bit aware of the time. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to introduce one final strategy, but then I really want to hear a bit more from you, so I want to reserve some time for conversation. So the final strategy that I would like to introduce deals with assessment design for student diversity. As I mentioned before, assessment quite fundamentally builds on the idea of standardization. The students should take part in assessment in similar ways, demonstrate similar outcomes or objectives against the same standards. And this makes me worried about the clash with the idea of student diversity, particularly in contexts where student diversity is increasing in higher education. And I think this clash between assessment standardization and student diversity, on the other hand, is something very substantial that unfortunately our students need to live through in higher education. Often this means that students need to stifle their diverse identities in assessment situations. So how could we design assessment to be more welcoming for diverse sorts of identities? This again is a matter of divergent tasks, complex tasks that allow students to demonstrate their selves and their abilities in many different ways. This doesn't have to mean anything very futuristic. Here I have a quote by one student who was explaining assessment tasks that allowed the students to redefine what is seen as normal and able in assessment situation. However, here, the practice in itself is not something very well-breaking. The practice in itself is something quite simple, but the effect that this practice had was very profound for the student. So, me and my colleague, we did a study about the assessment experiences of students with disabilities in the context of mathematics. And one of the students told us that in mathematics, pictures and colors can help us dyslexics a lot. Nowadays, I color code all my materials, particularly if there's much mathematical yarn. I use green, turquoise, all the colors are in use. It's much easier to read than just black and white. An image can be worth more than 1,000 words. For this student, the fact that the student was able to use colors in an assessment situation was something very, very profound for how the student came to understand themselves. This student shared us how only pen and paper-based tests, which are quite profound in mathematics, never allowed the student to show their dyslexic identities. And it was only the use of colors, again in a pen and paper test, that was this practice that was able to allow the students to demonstrate their skills in more diverse ways. The practice here is simply allowing the students to use colored pencils. And I think it was quite heartening to hear about the impact on the student themselves. To me, this example is powerful because it shows that a very simple practice can, in fact, allow us as students diverse ways of knowing and being and becoming in higher education. I did share you the slides, so if you want, you can have a look at the remaining ideas, but I'm a bit aware of the time and I really want to hear from you, and I want to hear what kinds of issues you might have seen in your own context. So I'm going to provide a few final words. First of all, let me just reiterate my main argument here. I do think we need to think about assessment in the longer term. We do need to ensure that when we talk about assessment, we talk about assessment as a part of a life course, not only as an individual task in an individual point of time. As we do this, we necessarily reframe our understanding of assessment as something that considers the histories of our students and at the same time influences their futures in quite profound ways. And I have provided some emerging ideas on how we might ensure that students themselves have more control, more agency over these processes, rather than being only seen as the objects of assessment, being shaped by assessment. I think there's a lot of power in the stories that we share about assessment and our own selves in this social world. The very least thing that we could do is to simply listen to these stories. Listen to our students. What kinds of stories do they have about assessment and their own selves? And I've tried to provide a few tools on how to perhaps reshape these stories if needed. As our students narrate their own professional selves, what is the role of assessment and feedback in these stories? This is a very exciting and intriguing question for me. One final thing that I wanted to mention was that as we talk about assessment as a part of a life course, we necessarily talk about time. We talk about temporal, continuous processes over time. And what this requires is indeed time. It requires us to rethink how we think about time in higher education, whether we see time as something linear or whether we see time as something a bit more messy, complex. Whether the structures of assessment and feedback allow us time for these conversations, these informal conversations, as in my story in the beginning, that might really shape us in the future. Do we have time for failures, time for new beginnings in higher education? And what is the role that assessment plays here? I think both of the stories that I started from, they really emphasize this idea of time and temporality. So let me wrap up by noting that I think there's a lot of power and a lot of promise from shifting our view from assessment and looking at those short-term effects that assessment might have to rethinking assessment from the viewpoint of the longer-term effects it holds to our students' lives, futures, and their very selves. In doing so, we need to think about assessment not only as a matter of immediate learning outcomes, but as a matter of students' longer-term processes of being and becoming. And if we would do this kind of a shift, I wonder what we might achieve. Thank you very much. We still have some time for conversation. 20 minutes. If you have any further thoughts, questions, ideas, do not hesitate to reach me out. Thank you.
You started with two examples.
Yes.
One positive, one negative. the positive one was an informal one and the negative was a formal one. Your research, is there a correlation between formal, informal, positive, negative encounters?
That is a tricky question because I do not really look at these types of correlations. I'm also a bit aware of this dichotomy of positive and negative. Mm-hmm. Sure, my examples were a bit dichotomous when it comes to that aspect, but often these processes are quite messy and complex, and it's not always easy to say what kind of an impact is positive or negative for students. Okay. Because even a very negative, immediate, say, feedback comment, a very critical comment, it might spark something quite positive in the future. So I'm not sure if I have an answer for you. I am currently doing a few longitudinal research projects where I'm looking at these sorts of things. But to me, it seems like the stories that students develop in higher education, they're quite complex. So I'm not sure if this dichotomy between positive and negative is eventually very constructive.
Okay. Why I ask, I was reflecting on my own encounters, and for me it was the informal one that was positive and the formal one that was negative. And one of the strategies you suggest was programmatic assessment. And I wonder, all those data points, you're making formal encounters. Isn't that tricky? Because they become formal encounters.
Yes, it is tricky.
Okay. Yeah, this is maybe not a question, but something I was wondering. Sorry.
So maybe I can follow up, because what then do you think? What are the traits of programmatic assessment where you are hopeful?
Sorry.
So programmatic assessment can help, but in what way? Because one of the earliest experiences in the Netherlands is that students start chasing data points. So it's becoming a mechanistical way of, okay, now I have to collect the data, and then somebody's going to give me a plus. And so what are the... of course, there are many good things in it, but what do you see as the good traits in programmatic assessment?
Oof, that is a big question. I could... this is exactly the criticism that I often hear about it. I'm not even sure if I have an immediate answer for you, but to me this is a matter of how to use those data points, how the whole idea is sold to students, and really trying to deeply understand if students, in a way, misinterpreted our message. Where does that idea originate from? Yeah. If we want our students to use those data points as the backbone of their professional identity, and students interpret the situation quite differently, as I think it's just chasing the data points, chasing higher scores, what's going on there, and what are the hindrances on the way? But again, it's also an example of a programmatic assessment of becoming a tool to shape students from afar, which to me goes back to the ethical question of should we do that, or should we allow more agency for students to do it themselves? Big questions, and I think this is why programmatic assessment, it really is a practical solution. Yeah. And when you start a conversation about it, you often end up in quite philosophical depths, which is wonderful, but tricky.
I've watched a keynote by Peter Senge, or Senji, I really don't know how to pronounce his name, from 1999, The Fifth Discipline, and he made me realize that the history of education lies in the military system and in our industrial society, and the basic metaphors are factories. So what you showed are that we organize education more than anything as a factory to box our students in the same time, rhythm, everything is standardized. So what I hear from you is a philosophical rhetoric about how to change the system. But I think we need to realize how deeply ingrained our factory mind, machine-like metaphor is in our society. And I think if you really want to change, you are up against a lot of unknown metaphors that we are all shaped by. And the pain of being reduced to one data point every time and time and time again starts in kindergarten. So I think we need to shift the conversation to a profound discussion about and pain, because we are shaped already as adults. I look back to my first gradings, and I had one mistake in 25 answers, and my teacher has said, that was one mistake. That's all I got. That was my feedback for 6 years in primary school. So I'm hopeful, and I think we need to go deeper.
Well, yeah, we are in an interesting time in the history, because that is true. And education very, very profoundly builds on the idea of standardization, as you say. But at the same time, the research community's educational policy, educational practice is all about self-determination, 21st century skills, unique students who are not clones of each other, but very much individuals. And this, almost like discursive clash, is something that is very much there. Because particularly in higher education, when you look at higher education policy, it's all about producing unique graduates who solve the problems of the future. But then when you look at assessment, it still builds on this idea of standardization. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true, but it's more about this tension at this point of time. And students are the ones who need to live through this tension. They are at the same time supposed to be industrial, and their skills and abilities are tested in a standardized way, but they're also supposed to be unique and self-determined. And it's quite a discursive tension to live with.
So it's a paradox. And
absolutely.
We discuss how to evolve through the paradox.
And discuss this with our students. In my work with students with disabilities, the tricky thing that I see with higher education students is that even when they graduate, they might have an understanding of themselves as disabled practitioners, as somehow wrong, as somehow less able practitioners. Because of this, they have needed to live through these tensions that we have in our educational system. And this is really something that I would say is an ethical dilemma. It's a paradox, but it's not an abstract paradox. It's a paradox that our students and teachers live through every day.
Well, that helps.
But we can do many things with the paradox. We can. You see some smiles, some are very puzzled faces at the moment.
Yes, thank you for your story. Do you think it might help if we develop assessments together with our students? And I think when the criteria or the standards are a bit more generic, that there's room for students, for them to build their own identity, so that it helps them build an identity instead of the other way around, that it's just got impact on their identity. How do you see that?
Absolutely, and this is something that I do as a teacher in pretty much all of my classrooms. I do not let my students be assessed if they haven't co-designed the process, at least to some extent. So yes, I see a lot of potential in this kind of thinking. I'm trying to think if any research comes to my mind about this particular issue. The idea of assessment co-design is a very hot topic at the moment. But so far, I would say this research is focused more on the learning benefits of the process, which is an important topic and a fascinating topic. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. It's also a risky topic It's not an easy fix or solution, but a very exciting idea, absolutely. And a very tangible way of providing more agency to students. Not just fostering critical thinking, but really providing agency.
Yeah, just curious. At least in the Netherlands, I see in a lot of higher and vocational education, it's all about getting to this one point where we say, now you're graduated, you can start as a professional. Just in an open sense, what's your take on that? Do we need to revisit that idea that we all educate these different students towards the same point, or do you think you can do justice to the diverse group of students while remaining like this standard?
Ooh, another big question.
Yeah, it's Friday afternoon, right? Yeah.
This is one of those questions that make me think that, give me 1 month and like some time on like a summer cabin with a pile of books, and I'll write something, and I'll write you a 10-page response. But
yeah, you want my email. September would be fun.
So, sounds intriguing. Yeah, I do think that it's a very, when we talk about the temporality of assessment and the assessment as a part of the life course, that tipping point of being in higher education and plop, not being in there anymore, being free from assessment, as one of my students said, it's a very fascinating moment in time. Yeah.
I'll just give you my email address. Yeah.
Thanks, Juuso. Really great talk. Loads of food for thought, even on a Friday afternoon. So thank you. My question is not too big, hopefully. I was really fascinated by your discussion about the power of words, not numbers, and the reflections about assessments, positionality within a metrics informed society. And certainly with our programme, we actually used to give numerical grades, 70, 62, etc. We moved to pass and fail, and we've seen like some really interesting outcomes. So my question is, have you got any research on the go about the differences between words and numbers and its impact?
Oh yes, there's quite a few approaches coming up. One of the most exciting projects that I recently finished up with was that I followed a collection of students through the first year of university. And I had a look at how assessment situations and grades in particular, for the lack of better terms, impacted their sense of themselves as developing future professionals. I'm a bit aware of sharing any findings from this emerging project.
You can keep it secret.
Huh?
You can keep them secret.
No, I was thinking more about like sharing not peer-reviewed knowledge in a conference situation. And this study was conducted in the context of Hong Kong, which is a very metric-driven society, perhaps more so than here in Europe. And I can certainly confirm that these students were thinking about numbers in a very, very substantial way. And the numbers, they have a lot of power in the learning and studying processes. I think there's something intriguing there. What's going on?
Yeah. I think they have agency to shape the way that we think. Agreed.
Exactly. The numbers do many things.
They do.
Yeah.
My question is in line with what you said. Is there a cultural difference between Asia and Europe and America, perhaps?
Oh, when we think about assessment as a part of a life course, it's necessarily a cultural issue. It's a social issue. It's a contextual issue. So, yes, for the sake of clarity, I need to talk about these issues in a relatively universal way. But all these processes would appear a bit differently in a different context. So, absolutely.
Are there things we can learn from Asia or other parts of the world? In the western of Europe or in the Netherlands?
When it comes to assessment and student identity formation, well, as a Finnish person, teaching and working in Hong Kong. Maybe the competitive culture is something that I often see as a bit of a warning example that I sometimes share to my Finnish colleagues. Working in a higher education system where the basic organizing principle is competition is, of course, something that influences assessment and feedback situations in a very profound way. Thank you. I think we might be almost out of time, but maybe we have time for... I would be glad to continue, but I think we might need to...
Okay, maybe it's a little bit big. Sorry. So, if you finish your education, you are free from assessment, but you're not free from being judged, because this is an integral part of professional life. So,
and human life.
Yeah, and human life. So, how do you see this relationship between being judged during your academic journey and afterwards?
That's a very good question, and I wonder if this is definitely one of those very contextual and cultural matters as well. In Hong Kong, in my research, my student and graduate participants often see it as a very big tipping point. Yes, of course you are judged in your marriage and at your workplace and so forth, but it's still very, very different to all that stuff that happens in education. And I wonder if that is exactly the same in other societies where assessment is perhaps not as competitive in the educational sector. But it's, yeah, and I think this would be a very intriguing research idea of looking at the very particular effects of educational assessment in higher education, and whether it is actually that different, or maybe it is. I'm not sure. I think we are out of time, and it is Friday afternoon, so please go enjoy the the sunshine. I'm in no hurry, so if you have any further questions, please just come here. But thank you so much for wonderful questions.